When I teach my undergraduates here in Carolina, a lot of them have no idea about why it is that Christianity became the religion of the Western world, and many of them think it was just sort of a matter of course that naturally that would happen. But when you explain to them how strange it really is, when just in the New Testament, I mean, right after Jesus dies, he's got 11 disciples and a handful of women who are his followers who believe in him, and so say 20 people, and within 300 years there are like 3 or 4 million of them. So how do you get from 20 people to 3 or 4 million in 20 years? And they naturally, my students tend to be conservative Christians from North Carolina, from the southern part of the United States, and they tend to have had a Christian upbringing, and they just assume it's a miracle.
Mm.
And so I'm not denying it's a miracle, but there are historical reasons too. And so I'm interested in the historical reasons. Well, yeah, well, that's the thing. I have to explain that in the book because when I say triumph, I don't present it in a triumphalist way. In other words, I don't say that, that it was a great victory that we should all be happy for. There are lots of things, of course, we should be very happy about with the success of Christianity, if nothing else, just culturally. I mean, you think about the entire culture of the West, in terms of art or literature, music, I mean, philosophy, you just wouldn't have our culture. And there's so much about our culture that we can be really grateful for. But there's also, of course, very serious downsides to the success of Christianity, and I talk about those a good bit in my book. And so I call it a triumph just because Christianity started out as basically a small group of people that nobody had heard of, and within 400 or 500 years, it became the religion of the empire and basically destroyed or conquered the other religions.
Mhm.
And so yeah, so basically, so it's a triumph in the kind of a, in that sense. I mean, somebody won. They won. Yeah, I think when you put it in the terms I just did, that you go from 20 people to 4 million or something, that it does sound miraculous. Like, how could that possibly happen? But if you actually just crunch the numbers as if you're a sociologist trying to figure out population growth, it's not that extraordinary. Christianity has to grow about every decade. It has to grow somewhere between 30 and 40% every decade, which means that if you've got 100 people this year, in 10 years you'll convert 30 or 40 people.
Mm.
And so that's not extraordinary, really. It's 2 or 3 or 4 people a year you're converting each one. And so it's not that's it. But when it happens over time. And so the question is, why does that happen over time within Christianity? There are lots of religions, of course, thousands of religions, technically speaking, throughout the Roman world at the time. And so why does that happen with Christianity? And what I argue in my book is that it's because there are distinctive features of Christianity that made it unlike anything in the Greek and Roman worlds, including in Judaism. And the two main things I talk about are that Christians, unlike everyone else, were trying to get converts. In Greek and Roman religions, there's no reason to convert somebody to your religion because there wasn't a sense that that it mattered for for their eternal life or anything. It just, people had different religions, and you could add on religion. You start worshiping Zeus after you worship Aphrodite, and then if you want to worship someone else, you just worship various gods. Christians said they had one God, and they were convinced they were right about that. And so they were out evangelizing, trying to convert people because they really did think that it mattered for eternal life if you believed the right thing. So they were both evangelistic, and they insisted that they were the only ones right, so that they were the only religion doing that. And so every time Christianity gained a convert, the other religions lost a convert. So paganism lost a convert. And you do that for 300 or 400 years, and you take over the empire. Well, so within the pagan world, and I don't use pagan as a derogatory term at all. I'm just describing the polytheistic religions of Greece and Rome in this case. Because they are polytheistic, people worship many gods, And moving to worship a new God didn't require you to give up your old gods, because there was no sense that you have to worship this God, or you're somehow in trouble. You can worship many gods. Christianity picked up from Judaism the idea that there's one God, the Creator, and Christianity had the idea that this Creator will not only brought the world into being, he will destroy the world's wickedness and bring in something new. And you have to be on the side of this God to survive this coming onslaught. So this was the earliest understanding of Christianity. And so Christians were concerned that you had to be on the right side. You had to be on the side of the true God. And so they wanted to convert family, friends, neighbors to believe, so that when this end came, they would find salvation, because otherwise they'd be destroyed. And so there was a kind of incentive behind Christianity that wasn't found in the Greek and Roman religions for converting people, because you have to be on the right side. Yeah, well, that's a good question, because it used to be thought, people, I mean, back when I was in graduate school, back in the 70s and 80s, people thought that Jews were on kind of a missionary thing. They were trying to convert people. But that turns out to be almost certainly wrong, I think. And so the question is why? And part of it is because Jews had their own religion, and most Jews thought that it's our religion. It's religion for people who are people of Israel. And so it's not your religion, it's our religion. And there's no reason for somebody to convert to become a member of Israel any more than, you try to convert somebody to become a member of Switzerland or America. So you don't try, I mean, and so they have their own customs, they have their own religions. And so Judaism, by and large, had no interest in spreading itself to other peoples. And it's coupled with the fact that most Jews, like most pagans at the time, didn't believe in an afterlife, and so there wasn't that you'd be punished afterwards. So there really just wasn't much of an incentive for it. It is a Jewish sect. I mean, his follower, Jesus was Jewish. His followers were Jewish. They were all Jewish, and Jesus was a Jewish teacher, the Jewish law, and they thought he was the Jewish Messiah. So it was very much a Jewish sect. Paul, I think in popular thinking, at least in America, it's often thought that Paul's the one who came up with the idea that the death and resurrection of Jesus is what puts a person into a right standing before God. And I think that's absolutely wrong. That view was around long before Paul. Paul probably converted 3 or 4 years after Jesus' death. And between the time Jesus died and Paul converted, there were Christian missionaries out there trying to convert people to believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus. What made Paul distinctive, and what was his contribution, I think, was that he's the one who realized that since the death of Jesus is what puts a person into a right standing before the God of Israel, that it wasn't anything else. It was the death of Jesus. It was not the Jewish law, for example. Following the Jewish law does not necessarily put somebody into a right standing before God for Paul once he converts. It's only the death of Jesus. But that means that a person doesn't have to follow the Jewish law to be right with God. And if that's the case, then it absolutely is universalizing. And that's why he goes on his mission to the Gentiles, because he realizes that through Christ, God now is saving the world, as was predicted in the book of Isaiah for Paul, that the whole world will come to worship God, and that it's going to happen through Christ. And it means that people don't have to be Jewish. They just need to worship the correct God through his son. Yeah, you would tend to think, what people would tend to think is that the only way to get this many people converting would be to have like big missionary rallies, like in America, Billy Graham events, where you have the amphitheater filled with people, and you have a preacher and they have an altar call, and people come down and convert, and it appears it wasn't that way at all. And in fact, we don't know the names of other major missionaries, with just about 2 exceptions in the first several hundred years of Christianity, apart from Paul. It's not that there are people that we know about who are out there doing that. Um, what does appear to be happening is when somebody becomes a follower of Jesus, they do so on the basis of stories they've heard about Jesus, and they've heard about his death and his resurrection and his miracles and things, and they may come to believe that Jesus is representing the true God, and they need to believe in Jesus. And then they tell their spouse, and they tell the stories to their spouse, who tells stories to his business partner, who tells to his spouse, who tells it to her cousin, and it goes like that by word of mouth. It looks like the spread of Christianity was almost always by word of mouth rather than by official missionaries. Well, I think the answer lies in why people worship the gods in the first place in the ancient world, which is much the reason people worship God today. Um, in the ancient world, especially, people almost always lived near the edge. I mean, it was very hard to survive, let alone thrive in the ancient world, because they didn't have modern medicine. They didn't have irrigation systems. They didn't have mass transportation systems. It was very, very difficult just to get by. And the thing about the gods is they could provide things that people themselves were unable to provide. And so the gods can make sure that it rains. They can make sure that the livestock multiply. They can make sure that you don't die in childbirth, or that the child doesn't die. They can do things that you can't do for yourself, and so the gods are worshipped because they provide what we need. And in many senses, then it's all about divine power. If in the pagan religions, if you become convinced that there's a God who can provide you with things that you need, you might begin worshiping that God. I mean, if you already worship, say, Zeus and Ares, but you find out that Apollo would be an important God for you to worship, you simply start worshiping Apollo then, in addition to Zeus and Ares and the others. The Christians insisted that their God was more powerful than all those other gods. And the hitch was that if you begin worshiping that God, the Christian God, you had to give up the other gods. And so the way Christianity succeeded was by convincing people that their God was far more powerful than other gods. And so if you could convince somebody of that, they might convert. And you don't need to convince lots of people. It's not that you talk to a room of 10 people one time and all 10 convert. It's that over time people start converting, but since they are leaving the pagan religions altogether, and there's no other religion that is doing that, both trying to make a convert and trying to get people to leave their own religion, since Christianity is the only one doing that, every time it grows a little bit, the pagan religions shrink a little bit. And you do that for 300 or 400 years and you take over the empire. The Mithraists weren't exclusivists, and so if you became a Mithraist, that was one of the ritualistic practices you engaged in, worshiping Mithras. Mithraism wasn't probably going to take over the world, even though some people have argued that it could have, but it was only for men, which leaves out half the population. Yeah. And and again, it wasn't exclusivistic, and it's so I don't think it had a chance of really taking over the world. It could have been a more widespread religion, but it wouldn't have gotten rid of the other ones. Christianity's success is that it not only expanded, but every time it expanded, the others contracted. Well, I think what most people would have realized that in many ways Christianity was like other religions. You have a divine being that you worship, you say prayers to, you ask for things from, and this is a powerful divinity who intervenes in the world. And so it's similar in lots of ways, but the difference is some about Jews, but Jews weren't insistent that you had to follow their God. And one thing that made Christianity stand out a bit from most religions was its emphasis on the divine, the almighty power of this one God, which is found not only in our lives now, but it's going to be manifest in the life to come. And so people who reject this God, because this God is the only God, he knows he's the only God, his people know he's the only God, and if you reject this God, you're rejecting the entire divine realm, and he's a just God. And so in the Christian tradition, the issues of heaven and hell become prominent and become part of the missionary discourse.
Mm.
Um, when Christians are trying to convert people, as I said before, they're emphasizing that God is powerful and that God can provide them with the things that they want. And if this power is manifest even after discourse, and it's like, how do you show God's power?
Mm.
Well, it seems kind of weird to us, but if you actually look at all the accounts of people converting in the ancient world from Christian sources or even non-Christian sources, they're converting because they think the Christians could do all these miracles.
Mm.
And I mean, the whole religion is based on Jesus' miracle rising from the dead. And then you have stories about Jesus doing miracles, but his apostles do miracles. And you have these stories about people seeing miracles and converting, but the miracles don't stop when you die. After death, God still does a miracle. He takes some people up to the heavenly realm and he punishes others forever.
Yeah.
And then you don't get that in pagan.
Yeah.
I mean, very often. I mean, you obviously get myths and things, but yeah. So this is a distinctive feature of Christianity that once more emphasizes the power of God. Oh, it's all over the place. I mean, it's in throughout the New Testament. I mean, Paul himself says that he did miracles among the Corinthians and such, and the book of Acts is filled with people converting because of miracles. If you read the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, like the Acts of John or the Acts of Peter, it's all because of miracles that people convert. And when you get into even a narrative, I mean, Justin, up through Augustine says he's seen all these miracles that convert people. And so what's going on with all of this? My view of that is, as a historian, is that you don't need to have miracles in order to have stories of miracles.
Mm.
There are about 2 billion people in the world today who identify as Christian. All of them believe that Jesus did miracles. None of them saw any of Jesus' miracles. They've heard about it.
Mm.
And that's, I think, how it happened in early Christianity. You told stories of miracles. So people didn't have to see the miracles to be convinced by the miracles. And I think that's what happened. I think recent scholarship, I think, has shown that a lot of the a lot of the stories about martyrdom may not be historical. In other words, we tend to think that the thousands and thousands of people are dying for their faith, and it probably is not thousands and thousands and thousands of people dying for their faith, but some did.
Mm.
Some absolutely did. And Christians, of course, not the only ones dying for a cause, but they do die for a cause on occasion. And the narratives, I think, are especially important. Whatever happened historically, say to someone like Polycarp, the narrative is very important because it's a story that people tell and it makes an impact.
Mm.
And one of the significant things about these stories is the emphasis that you find repeatedly that these martyrs are willing to suffer for a brief time and be tortured to death because they know that they'll be rewarded forever.
Mm.
And you have these rather graphic accounts where the martyrs will be, being torn apart by beasts or whatever. And they'll say, well, or being burned by fire. And they'll say, well, this is, for a few minutes, but, you're going to have this for eternity.
Mm.
And so that's the payoff. It's a little bit of pain now versus pain for all eternity. And that appears to have been convincing to a number of people. Well, I think a lot of the stories probably were invented, but we don't have good historical records for for a lot of the narratives we have. We just have the narratives. Some of the narrative accounts do look like they look to me like they're historical, that they're actually not quite stenographic notes, but it looks like some of these do go back to events that happened. I do think there was a lot of Christian imagination that multiplied them. For a long time, people have noted, for example, that Eusebius, the fourth century church father, will talk about these massive persecutions of these, hundreds of people dying, and he'll be able to name like two of them. And so it's not clear how much exaggeration is going on. But I don't think the entire thing was invented. I think absolutely people died for their faith, just they do now. And there's no doubt that during something like the persecution of Valerian or Diocletian, that these were actual persecutions that ended up many people, I don't know how many people dying. Well, the problem with dealing with issues like this is that the Roman Empire was a very big place, and there are different cultures in different places, and women had different roles in different places, and it depends on what kind of status women had. Upper class women had a far greater role in public issues than lower class women, and so it kind of depends. But it is pretty clear that at least early on in the Christian movement, probably in the life of Jesus, and I think certainly in the life of Paul, women had a more prominent role than was typical in the specific environments. Paul is sometimes thought of as one of the great misogynists, but I think that's a complete misread of that. Our passages that Paul didn't write. I mean, there's this passage in 1 Timothy chapter 5 about women having, 1 Timothy chapter 2 about women having to be silent in the church and not exercising authority over men, and something like that in 1 Corinthians 14. I don't think Paul wrote 1 Timothy at all, and I think this passage in 1 Corinthians 14 is an interpolation into his letters. I don't think that it's authentic. When you actually look at what Paul says, I mean, he has all these women who are active doing things. I mean, Romans 16 is the sort of the go-to place for many people about this. You have various women who are doing various things in the churches, including one woman, Junia, who's described as foremost among the apostles. Wow. And so I think what ends up happening is that as Christianity spreads, the dominant ideology in which men are to be in charge takes over, and the voice of women gets silenced over time within Christianity. But that it started out as being a religion that in which women could be and were prominent on many occasions. And it's an interesting question. Was that attractive to women? Was the idea that you could actually have a bigger role in society, in this Christian society, than you could outside, was that an attraction? Some people have argued that. I think it's hard to know based on our evidence, but you could see the logic of it anyway. What many people have argued is that because of this kind of fellowship idea, people of lower status were able to acquire kind of a higher status within this small community, and that may have been attractive to people, because it kind of could elevate their status within this community, even if at the broader world, they might be a slave, for example, but even within the Christian community, they were treated as an equal. And so maybe that was part of the attraction. Yeah, no, it's very difficult because I think for a long time, especially in the Protestant tradition, it was widely, the only thing that was emphasized was doctrine, right? What really mattered is belief. You got to believe the right things, and all the Christians were interested in was developing their theology. And even within biblical studies, as you know, I mean, for a long time, studying early Christianity meant studying early Christian doctrine. And so you try to see how these doctrines developed over time. And it wasn't really till the 80s or the 1980s where there was a pretty significant intervention by people like Gert Tyson and Wayne Meeks and people who were trying to look at the kind of the social aspects of Christianity. And I remember this quite well because Wayne Meeks came out with his book, the First Urban Christians, when I was a graduate student at Princeton Theological Seminary. And at Princeton Theological Seminary, when we studied Paul, we were studying the theology of Paul, right? His doctrine of justification, his doctrine of this, that, or the other thing. It was about understanding his theology, his apocalyptic theology, or whatever. And Wayne Meeks came to and he give his talk about kind of the social arrangements of Pauline communities. And I remember one of my professors saying that he didn't care. He didn't care about the social arrangement, and the way he put it, he was kind of a little bit of a crude guy. He said, I don't care where Paul went to the bathroom. I want to know what your justification is. Said, well, okay. But since then, people realize that what I would say, you can't separate the theology and the social life as if they're completely distinct things. It's a package. And if you ignore one, then you're ignoring a very big part of the picture. And so I'm one of these historians who's interested, of course, in the history of ideas and theology and development of doctrines, but also interested in what it was like on the ground to be a Christian. And different people have different interests, but I don't think you should, I don't think people should say that one is more important than the other. They're both really important. Well, I'll tell you for years I really liked the work of Ramsey McMullen at Yale, who was a colleague of Wayne Meeks, and he has this book on the Christianization of the Roman world. And I loved this book, and I used to assign it to my students, and my students never liked it. And I couldn't understand why, but then I realized it's because he's saying things in such a condensed way that they didn't really quite get it. But I think the work of Ramsey McMullen it's been very significant for me. I think there are a lot of books about the spread of Christianity that have been popular that I don't like very well. Probably the most popular one in America some 20 years ago was Rodney Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity. And all of my colleagues didn't like the book. Nobody liked it, but I kind of liked part of it. The part I really liked was he was a sociologist. So he knew how to crunch numbers. And so, people had long thought that you just can't have the growth of Christianity either without miracles or without fantastic evangelistic rallies. And he showed, no, it doesn't work like that. And his argument was that you could show that Christianity grew at a rate of 40% every decade for the first 300 years. And that if you do that, you get from the small number to the huge number, and so that's what you need. There ended up being problems with that analysis, but that part was good. The parts I didn't agree with is when he tried to come up with reasons for why people were accepting Christianity, and that's a place where he just didn't know the sources well enough to be able to understand how you analyze. When Tertullian says something, whether you just take it on face value or not. And so he's not a historian of early Christianity, but the idea of of a growth rate, so that you don't need miracles and you don't need evangelistic rally, I thought was really useful. I mean, if you want the data, Harnack there's nobody like him, and it's true. But the analysis I think is problematic, but the data that he can get out of the sources is absolutely still worth looking at. No, absolutely. I mean, I'm not a critic of the faith in the sense that I'm opposed to Christianity at all. I'm opposed to fundamentalist Christianity, and I think it does a lot of harm. I'm no longer a Christian myself, though I was for most of my life, but I'm not any longer, but not because of this kind of scholarship. I'm writing a book right now that actually is dealing with what I think is really one of the major positive contributions that Christianity brought to the world, which has to do with its original understanding of ethics. In the Greek and Roman worlds, of course, people loved their families and they loved their friends, tried to be, but the idea that you should be concerned for those who were in desperate need, who are not related to you, you didn't know, who are strangers, but you should still be concerned about them and try to help them, was very much a teaching of Jesus. and it got modified as Christianity went on. There weren't a lot of Christians 200 years later saying we should love our enemies. They just didn't. They might have said it, but they didn't really do it. But the idea of providing, of giving to charity to help those in need was a prominent feature of Christianity. Christians invented hospitals, and public hospitals, and invented orphanages and governmental support for the poor. And I think this is one of the real contributions of Christianity to the world. And it starts with Jesus, and it's right there in the New Testament. And the striking thing, at least in my country, is that many people who claim to be devout Christians and even Bible believing Christians have a completely different social agenda, from helping those who are in need, to helping the foreigner, to helping the immigrant, to helping the poor and the homeless. They have a completely different social agenda, and they seem to think that their agenda is coming from the Bible when it's not coming from the Bible at all. And so I think if people, I think that the ethical teachings of Jesus, as they get carried on through the Christian tradition, can still do the world a lot of good. And so I'm very much in support of that.